back in Jude, now that we've got all the laughing out of our system, and we've made it down to Jude 6, and I just want to let you know, I just had a moment this past week where I took pressure not off of you, but off of me. And the pressure is, and especially Cecil knows this because Cecil had to do, the pressure is when you've got like a timeline, the timeline decides how you're going to teach. But then I started realizing there are very few times in my life where I don't have a timeline or a time frame. Sunday mornings, I know people say you can talk all you want, but trust me, if you're a preacher, you know that there's like a point in the message where you get past a certain time where people just start checking out. But I just started thinking, you know what? It doesn't matter if we don't finish Jude by the summer. I'm just going to go at the pace that the book lends itself. There's going to be times where we might be able to catch a couple of verses. I really thought we were going to be able to get through 6 and 7 tonight, but then it turned out to be an impossibility. And so I'm just going to let it take the time it takes. And, 5 years from now, if we're still not to verse 25, we'll just get there when we get there. So pressure's off because I really want by the time we get to the end of this book to be like, and I feel like I'm telling jokes because of Mark Lowry. I feel like you're either going to be like, I never want to look at that book again, or I'm so thankful that we took the time to walk through with this. And tonight is just a very unusual thing because, again, we're kind of in this middle of 3 pieces of information where Jude is saying, you already know this, but I think I need to tell you anyway. And last week, he just reminded them about what God did with the people in the wilderness, and we learned some very valuable lessons, not necessarily just about the judgment of God, but really last week I feel like the walk-away lesson was whether or not when we get into critical situations, whether we lean towards fear or faith, deciding how we're going to respond to that situation. So I kind of feel like that was the lesson. Today's lesson is totally different. We are talking about angels, and it's one of those lessons. There are some lessons in the Bible that you feel like, a warm blanket would be nice tonight, but this is not one of those passages. This is a very serious passage. It's a very clarifying passage, and it's very serious by design. He's not teaching about angels for the sake of angel curiosity. Sometimes if you hear a message about angels, it's just that people are curious about angels. I should have asked this before, but I'm going to do it anyway. Marge, what is the premise of the angels Bible study? I know y'all have a large group of women going through a Bible study on angels. What is the premise for that study?
Well, basically, angels bring us hope.
Okay.
And there's an acrostic for angels.
Are you looking at different angels throughout the scripture, or?
Yes, starting in creation, it'll go all the way through Revelation.
Cool. And so there's always people are interested in angels because it's not something that we know a lot about. We hear some stuff about it and we learn about it in Scripture, but this one is just totally different. He's not teaching out of angel curiosity. He's really reminding us believers about real judgment. If you take verses 5, 6, and 7 together, it's like God judged his people in the wilderness. Now it's God judged angels who acted improperly. And then next week, it's like God judged an entire city regarding sexual sin. So it's 3 different things, and he wants to remind believers, these believers in Jude, about judgment. And the 2 biggest things is that next week we're going to learn about cities that got involved with forbidden desires. The angels tonight, they're going to cross boundaries that God established for them. That's going to be the purpose that God deals with them the way he does. And pretty much what we're going to learn at the end of this is privilege does not cancel accountability. So when you think of angels, you're like, well, angels, they always do what's right. Jesus created them just to be exactly how they are. But we learned in Scripture that there are a group of angels that rose up and they got thrown down. And they are fallen angels and they're Satan's and his demons. Well, what we're talking about tonight isn't just that entire group. We're talking about a very specific group who did something and God made an instant judgment on them. And the whole lesson really that the church is going to have, and we're going to have, the church that he's writing to in Jude and us, is this, that God does not overlook rebellion. Now, we may think, okay, why does he keep talking about rebellion? Why does he keep, is he afraid that the church is going to rebel? Well, it seems like he's keep telling these rebellion stories. But when you break down Jude, what you see that's going to happen is that these false teachers who have gotten in are trying to pull people away. And then what Jude's going to be trying to say is you need to stand up and fight against these false teachings, and you need to encourage other people who are being pulled away or who are following these truths. So he's really trying to give some encouragement to the church that God is faithful to those who are faithful to him, but he deals with situations severely when people are not. And so he just wants them to know, if people are coming against the church, God sees it. He's going to deal with it. But he also wants them to know, be encouraged that God is just as serious about keeping you as he is about dealing with his judgment. So he's writing to believers, people like us who are facing false teachers, slipping into the church, and he just wants to remind them, be faithful, and here is how God dealt with judgment. So our verse tonight is Jude 1:6. If somebody will read Jude 1:6, we'll introduce the angels, what happened to them, and how God responded.
And the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day.
Okay, and so you see this, and if you saw this and just kind of breezed past it, the angels judged. Some people would just automatically say, oh, he's talking about Satan and the fallen angels. But the problem is, if you look at this, what he's saying is, these angels he's talking about, he has them in eternal chains, under glooming darkness, until the judgment comes. In other words, he isn't just making a broad stroke conversation about Satan and his fallen angels, because we know that spiritual activity is alive. So even though these are angels who fell with Satan, he is talking about a very specific group of angels who did something, and he is not responding like reacting, but he is judging their action and is even showing us exactly what they did. And I think that's part of the lesson for the church. So there are three things that Jude tells us in the judgment that we know about these angels that are positive to start with. These angels had three things. They had a role, they had a realm, and they had a responsibility. Meaning, basically, even in their fallen nature, there was like a certain place that they could not go, could not do. God had provided boundaries, even in their fallen nature. God just doesn't allow Satan to do anything he wants to do, roam wherever he wants to go. Even in his fallenness, God has boundaries. There are things that he's going to allow and not allow. And there are three things that these Satans did. They had a role, they had a realm, and they had a responsibility. And their punishment is based on one thing. They chose to leave what God had given them. Look at the verse again. They did not stay within their own position of authority, but they left their proper dwelling. They have a role, they have a realm, and they have a responsibility. They didn't do what they were supposed to be doing. They left a realm and they left a responsibility. They were, at the very beginning, created for a purpose. We know they've fallen. And even as they've fallen, they've done something, an action that's causing God to deal with it. The reason it's specific like this is because this is not confusion. This is rebellion. It's weird to think about rebellion in an angel, but again, we always go back to the fallen angels and Satan's demons and how they interact. That's these people, and they did something. I was thinking about willful rebellion, and I went back to my childhood. My father was a pastor, and so on Friday nights, this is like all the way up to the age of 17. On Friday nights, I had like an 11:30 or midnight curfew. It was a normal size curfew. But on Saturday nights, it was like 10 o'clock or 9:30. I don't remember exactly what it was. But Friday night was a little later than normal. Saturday was earlier than normal. This is older, when I'm older, like 16, 17, driving, all that kind of stuff. But on Saturday night, his thing was, I need to be in the bed. I got to preach in the morning, and I'm not going to be in the bed to rest till all my kids are in and accounted for. And he had what I call an authority, accountability, aftermath system. You come home early. My dad was in bed when I got home. He needed Sunday rest. That was spoken to me with authority. When I came home, if I was supposed to be home at 10 o'clock, if I was home at 10:01, my dad did not see that as confusion. He saw it as willful rebellion. That 1 minute, willful rebellion. I made the mistake one time. I was going to be late. There was no way I was going to make it home. So I thought if the girl that I was with called my dad, I don't know how this made sense in my head, and said, hey, Mark's with me. We're trying to is not. And he was so polite to her. I was like, whew, I'm so good. But when I got home, it was, you have rebelled against my authority. And not only that, but let me talk to you about accountability. I thought my dad had absolutely no trust in me. And to be fair, trust should be earned. But my dad had a good night expectation. And every time on Saturday night, I had to wake him up and tell him good night. And he was like, you're going to tell me good night, like very, very close. And so I'd be like, good night, Dad, closer. Good night, Dad, closer. Good night, Dad. And what it was an alcohol check. And so it was like accountability, verification, and then there was an aftermath. And so I just want you to know, like, when I was a child, I thought, man, my dad is just so hard on me. But what he was he was trying to help me understand, I'm not judging confusion. I'm dealing and making sure you don't fall into a place where you are a rebellious. Sin often begins when God-given limits are treated as optional. And that's why a lot of times as parents, we might tend to overreact in a situation like when a kid comes home at 10:05, because we know in our hearts that this is a sign of a rebellious spirit. And where will this go if not unchecked? And I think that's one of the things that God is really thinking about as Jude is teaching this church is these people who fall away from truth. Not the people who are teaching false teachings, but people who have allowed the seeds of the Gospels to land on either weedy soil or rocky soil, who are basically, Pastor Max calls these people, if I don't get this wrong, these people are following, but they haven't yet decided to become a believer. They're following, listening to what Jesus says. They're liking it, they're following it, they're listening, but they haven't yet said, yes, I want to make you Lord of my life. That those people can little by little be pulled away from the Lord. And so he wants them to see that God takes this very, very serious. It's true for humans. It's true for God's people in the wilderness. It's true for angels. And so the consequences of their action, what is it in verse 6? What has God done with them? Where are these angels right now as we speak? Fallen angels. They're restrained right now under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So they have already been removed and they're already restrained. Not yet sentenced, but they are locked up. It's just kind of like we think when somebody doesn't get parole, they're locked up, but they're waiting for the judgment. The bad part is they're locked up waiting for the judgment. There is no lawyer. There is no, like the judgment's already been decided. They've just been removed from pretty much being allowed to be where they are. I want to take each piece of these is that they are kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the day of judgment. The first thing is that God, He has kept. He's pulled them out. He's locked them up. I did research on this and thought this was so cool, is that when we think about the enemy and the way he is in the world, it seems chaotic, but really there's no chaos, there's no revenge, there's no panic. God has not lost control of the situation. God saw them acting in a situation, they crossed a line, He removed them from the situation. It's not God reacting, it's Him acting decisively. It's just always a reminder for me, and should be for you, is that nothing comes to us that doesn't come through the hands of God. If something happens in our life, God has allowed it to happen. God doesn't sit by idly and say, I didn't catch that. I'm so sorry, Mark. Nothing comes to us that doesn't. It's just a reminder that He is in control. He made the decision just to pull them out. Because sometimes in spiritual warfare, we get a little scared. I know I've been in situations with Kim. I think there's 2 times where I've been in a situation where things felt really satanic. One, always around in New Orleans. People always say Las Vegas is Sin City. I've been to Las Vegas and I lived in New Orleans. New Orleans is Sin City, and it's usually only Sin City around like a couple blocks downtown. And the reason that feels like that is because you can just tell when you walk around Bourbon Street, it's just a place where the enemy feels like he wants to get even good people to make bad decisions. And so I've been there and felt like, oh, this is just a very dark place. But the biggest place is when we were in the underground in Atlanta, and there were just so many like weird things happening that all of our students realized we are around some things that are in spiritual warfare. It wasn't just us. There was just an acknowledgement that it's spiritual warfare. And so it's just a reminder that God is in control. Second thing is He's got them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. They're in confinement, not dealing with their final punishment yet. I want to show you what Peter says about this, because one of the things you'll see in Jude is when you read 2 Peter 2 and you read Jude, you'll realize that they are pretty similar. And the only really difference is Jude has a much more this is happening now, where 2 Peter has a this is coming. And we now believe, because of what Jude says, that he is aware of Peter's letter and even relying on some of Peter's letter for what he says. So when you see what Peter says, it's like Jude probably had this information. Somebody read 2 Peter 2:4, because this is what Peter writes about the same group of angels.
For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment.
Okay, so Peter says the same thing, but Peter actually lists as that they are regardless of where they are, they have not yet been judged. The biggest keys are this isn't talking about all demons. This isn't talking about the fall of Satan, although these are those angels that have become fallen angels that have done something, and they have not been judged. They're just locked away waiting for the great judgment. Now, I want to show you this because I think this is not, it's not like cool, like that was cool, Mark Lowry, cool. But it's an interesting thing, is how fallen angels feel about what Jesus did to the angels. We have a story in the New Testament, and I'll just read it. It's where Jesus is interacting with some fallen angels. And again, I don't know how the spiritual world works, but I know that these demons, fallen angels, same thing that Jesus is dealing with, are very aware that there are angels locked up and waiting for the end. So Jesus is dealing with these demons, and here's the conversation that Jesus has with them. Jesus asked him, the demon, "What is your name?" And he says, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. So he says, "Our name is Legion." And they begged Jesus, "Do not command us to depart into the abyss." In other words, don't throw us down there where you threw those other angels. Please, there's a herd of pigs over there that were feeding on the hillside. And they begged him, "Please, let us enter those pigs." So here's him in control again. He gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man, entered the pigs, and he heard them rush down the steep bank into the lake and drown. So these demons knew they wanted to continue to have a negative impact and not be put away in the abyss. So it's just Peter saying it, Jude saying it, and then we see in the New Testament that these demons were like, we don't want that to happen. So far, Jesus is dealing with some specific angels who have a specific sin, and he's locked them away. Any questions, concerns, thoughts about where we are right now before we go further? Because it's a different kind of conversation. So I want to make sure I'm not speaking too fast and rushing through it. Gary?
If you had to guess, why would you think
what we're reading now in Jude, or what when he?
Peter, like the one you just read.
Okay, so there are 9 instances of the judgment of God and what we learn in God judging in specific situations in Jude. We've dealt with one. Today we're dealing with number 3. Number 2. Next week we'll deal with number 3. Verse 8 is kind of the linchpin verse. Somebody read verse 8, and I feel like that answers your question, even though we're really not going to talk about it tonight. Somebody will read Jude 1:8, or just 8.
In the very same way, these dreamers pollute their own bodies, reject authority, and slander celestial beings.
Keep going into 9.
But even the archangel Michael, when he was disputing with the devil about the body of Moses, did not dare to bring a slanderous accusation against him, but said, "The Lord rebuke you."
Okay, we'll stop there. Basically, he's saying, he didn't say it as clear as I thought he did in 8, but he gets down through it in like 8 through 10, is like God's going to deal with these people this way. So these people are even crossing boundaries that these people who are in the church right now, God is going to deal with them. So the judgment is leading to, even in Peter, you can see Peter's getting there. He says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, casted them into hell and committed them in chains of gloomy darkness to be kept in the judgment." And then I think Peter immediately goes into Noah and what God did during the day of Noah. But Peter's getting to the point of God is going to deal with these people who are causing the church harm. But his main message in Jude is how to get the church prepared to fight against the falsehoods that are going to happen. So it is because he's trying to show them God is not going to do these things. He's already done these things in history. We can learn from them so that we understand the heart of God beyond just, so many people just say, well, God really is not. God is a merciful God. And I had said in a sermon about Kirk Cameron, and I was very careful. I said, I don't know exactly what Kirk Cameron said, but I know that he put himself in a position where at least people are accusing him of saying that there is not a literal hell. And so I tried to find different things about it, and it was really quiet for a long time. And I think the reason was because he caused so much uproar over whatever he said that he backed away from it. But now he has not backed away from it. Now he has re-entered the conversation, and he specifically showed a message. The reason it gets to me is Mark Driscoll is he showed a message of Mark Driscoll where Mark Driscoll was explaining that eternally there's an absence to be in hell, or eternally there's an absence to be with Jesus, and he just says that's not biblical. And it's like red flag, red flag. And what he's saying is that he can prove in 2 sessions with some great theologians that God never said hell is eternal, that it's just bad until you die. And so he officially is going into it's like an annihilism. And so I just feel bad about it because he's just been such a good, solid person to put out there in front of people that people like and understand, but it looks like he's going into an area that doesn't match Scripture. I even to the point today when I saw it, I just started reading all kinds of things about hell, and I was like, I don't even know how he gets here. But people are always going to try to undermine the judgment of God. God is letting us know you can't undermine it, because all throughout, you see how God acts, and he's always got to be just. Now, the final thing we see in God's acting, there are 3 things. He is kept, he's in control. There are eternal chains under gloomy darkness. This isn't all demons. It isn't making some sweeping thing, talking about a specific group of people. And until the judgment of the great day. Now, we as a church, a lot of churches you might go into and say, hey, if somebody said the great day, would you have any idea what they're talking about? In some churches, I've never heard anything about it, because some churches may stay away from Revelation and the great day and the second coming of Christ and the millennium and all that thing. But we just spent an entire semester on it. And so for us, I do believe we as a church understand that the great day represents like the end and judgment when God is going to do some final things. A lot of things we read in Revelation 20. We very specifically understand what it is. But I want to show you something. Can't go that way. I want to show you something because I'm going to say tonight, I'm not touching the day of judgment. And I don't want it to be like, oh, you're just chicken. You don't want to do it. You don't want to talk about it. But I want to show you something that this is the two verses that I'm thinking why I'm thinking these are the kind of verses in Jude. Somebody will look at Jude 1, 14 and 15. Here is a 2-verse conversation about the day of judgment. And the reason I'm not talking about today is when we get to verse 14 and 15, I don't even know how long it's going to take us to walk through this conversation. Just how he uses so few of words, and watch how many things he says in these 2 tiny verses. Somebody read 14 and 15 of Jude.
Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him.
And so when we get in 14 through 15, we're going to spend time, and we're even going to go back to Enoch, which again with Jude uses some outside of Scripture information, but once he puts it into Scripture, it is now in Scripture, is that Enoch prophesied some things, and even though we see Enoch in the Bible, there are some things he said about, according to Jude, about the coming judgment that Jude is thinking about and going to share more information about us in 14 to 15. So you can just mark on the great day. Pastor Mark said we're not talking about it tonight, but we are going to talk about it fully in 14 through 15. The one thing that I want us to think about is this, though, is what God is showing us even in how he treats these angels. It's reminding us that history is moving somewhere. You know, people just say like the world's out of control, or I don't know where everything's going to end up. Man, everything's falling into. No, it's not. The world is going exactly where we know it is. I mean, he's telling you here, I'm placing a group of angels somewhere until I do exactly what I said I'm going to do, which is come back as the righteous judge and deal with fallen angels, fallen men, and people that are sinners. So this is just a reminder that evil isn't just managed here. It's going to be answered at the end. God is showing just that he's not like making it's not that he's not wanting to judge them. He is judging them just the way he is expected to. He's showing us exactly how that is. So Jude, again, not just curious about angels. If God just did this to angels, he will not overlook rebellion in the church. God's patient, does not cancel justice. It just has delayed it. So that's what he's telling us about the angels. Now, I told Cecil I was going to stay away from this, but then I changed my mind because the more I studied about it, the better I felt about having this conversation. When you look at what Peter says about these angels, and when you look at what Jude says about these angels, and specifically this is the reason I really wanted to talk about the Genesis 6 text. I don't know if you remember this, but last week Jude said to us, now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it. And then he told them about what happened in Egypt. And so he's like, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. This is the word that got me, is the deeper that I studied. Then he adds a big word, which is and. He adds the and in verse 6, and then he adds the and in verse 7. And I know that I want a shirt that says, what is the therefore? It's important to me why is the and there in verse 6 and the and there in verse 7 is because he is assuming his readers understand what he's about to talk about in 6 and what he's about to talk about in 7. So this is something that they would have been taught. They wouldn't have raised their hand and said, like, what are you talking about? It would have been common knowledge to them. But again, he's saying you need to hear about it again. So in 6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept them in eternal chains. Then he gets to 7, just as in Sodom and Gomorrah. And then when he gets to 8, he hones in on the purpose for all this is to understand these people who are doing this, I am going to judge them. I'm also preparing you as a church to stand up and fight for the truth. So Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 is and I want you to hear this big word, right? It's a huge word. Probable. Most likely, I'm going to use the word probable. It is the only example that these people would have had of a group of angels who were judged that would have been common knowledge to them. Well, Pastor, why are you introducing it? I'm introducing it because since this is probable, when you see where it is in the line of God dealing with mankind, it's right before the flood. So it's actually judgment placed in the middle of judgment as he's talking to people in Jude about, I'm not going to let these things happen without dealing with it in judgment. But just as sure as that, you can also be just as sure that I will protect my church and the faithful. So he's using this story. And again, I'll explain why we're looking at it. Probable, not just that, but explain a couple reasons why we're looking at it. So Jude chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. This is the only kind of situation where we have what the people could have known about. So this, again, is a very probable of what these angels did. Somebody read verses 1 through 4.
When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old men of renown. Okay.
That is probably not a story that has 3 points in a poem that you heard growing up. It's just because very serious story. And it's a very hard story to talk about, but it's truth. And again, it's strategically placed right in the middle of the flood section. So chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Now, I want somebody to read Genesis 6, 5 through 6. You probably never heard 1 through 4 preached, but now when you hear 5 through 6, you'll be like, oh, I know that text. Genesis 6, 5 through 6, right after he talks about the Nephilim and the sons of God.
Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth. He was grieved in his heart.
Okay, so that's this story, that's where God's mind is. And even in 1 through 4, we're going to be able to see some of his mind. And so the big question that we need to ask when we look at this is, because it's a very important question to ask, is who is he talking about when he's talking about the sons of God? And again, this is where people will disagree. So I'm going to talk about 3 different things that people say, but then you look at them, you have to kind of make up your own mind like, well, that doesn't even make sense, or this makes sense. If you look at this, it looks very, very odd that he could be talking about 2 groups of people that I'm talking about. So the first thing that I want us to look at is, who are these people? The first thing is, the reason we believe that these are the sons of God are angels and not human rulers. Some people think that these are human rulers, maybe kings from the east who thought of themselves as divine beings and just forced themselves upon the women. And then what we're reading is about these group of particular leaders who thought they were divine. That's why they called themselves the Son of God. That whole thing there, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the one thing that a lot of people think, other than them being angels, is some people believe that what he's talking about is the sons of God, as some people believing that he's talking about the godly descendants of Seth, maybe have looked upon some ungodly descendants of Cain. And when that happened, they had children with the ungodly descendants of Cain. And that's what all this is talking about. The only problem is, if that's true, Genesis chapter 6 is the only time that God would have used the word sons of God and not been talking about angelic beings. So the word sons of God in Old Testament usage, mainly in Job, he's talking about angelic beings, sons of God, angelic beings. And then New Testament, same thing. 2 Peter 2, 4 through 5, Jude 1, 6 through 7, angelic beings. And then Jude explicitly links this to a specific sin, and so does Peter. And so those two reasons, New Testament usage, Old Testament usage, and then the final thing is Jewish tradition and early Christian interpretation. Back when this originally, and the Bible was written, and there are all these other documents written outside of the Bible, almost everybody, including the writings of Enoch, made this, understood that this was talking about angels. And so I'm just saying there's a great probability that he's talking about angels. One, Jude says they know the story. Two, the Old Testament uses sons of God in this way. New Testament uses sons of God in this way. Jewish theologians used it this way. This looks like it's the probable story. I just don't want to put it out like, I know that I know that I know that I know, because I don't. So any questions about why I took that much time? I'm just always real careful when there are things that we feel really good about. But I just don't want to put it out as fact, as that we get to heaven and God's like, you missed it. And they're like, I'm going to find Pastor Mark and get him. Which I don't think you're going to do that in heaven. So that's the sons of God. Any question? Because what we really want to look at is God's response to them. Because God's response to them is pretty serious and very teaching. Cecil? Yeah, Job, we have it in Job 1:6, 2:1, 38:7. So Job, 3 different times he uses it very specifically, angelic. Any questions about, we believe these are angelic beings that God's talking about. So we see what they did. Basically, men were growing. There are a lot of men coming on the earth. These beings looked down on the daughters of man, thought they were attractive, took them as their wife, had babies with them. These babies became not only evil people, but very strong people, and people really, really thought they were like amazing people, even though they were not godly people. They were like men of antiquity. They were like, these old strong giants that were like sinful, and everybody was scared of them. And so when you hear that word, and we'll talk about it later, they were great, not in God's eye, but in man's eye. Pastor Max?
Maybe another case you could make is that 2 times in those verses it said, and they were with daughters of men.
Yeah.
Because if they had been human, they wouldn't have had the set of men.
Yeah, to go another way, the reason people go another way is because Jesus says in the New Testament some things about angels where it looks like an angel couldn't do something like this. And the person who does the best to me there are just certain men that when you get into a tight place, hopefully no man feels like, I never need to go study something more. We're always learning until we die. But David Jeremiah handles this about as good as anybody that I know, which is we know how demons operate in the Bible, that it's a very good probability that the demons pretty much just took over men and took over these men for the purpose of, in these men as demons, creating babies that were just the Nephilim. So it doesn't matter in our mind how it happened. It just looks like it happened and that God dealt with it immediately. And how God dealt with it tells us a lot about how God feels about judgment. Just like last week, we didn't leave here saying, oh, wow, we leave here fearful of God's judgment. I feel like last week I left here convicted of, as a Christian, when things get tight, fear can lead me in the wrong direction, and I can let fear, just like the 10 spies or Israel, I can let fear make, is Caleb and Joshua and David, when things got tough, they said, we trust God. We trust God. God will save us. God doesn't lie. And so that's kind of where we are. So God's response in Genesis 6:3, this could be a sermon, and you look at it and you wouldn't even think this is a sermon within itself. It doesn't look like a big deal. He says 3 things. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever. But that doesn't look like that big of a statement, but it is. And then he says, for he is flesh. Again, doesn't look like that big of a statement. And then he says, his days shall be 120 years. And each one of those things is pretty powerful when you get to studying. The first thing he says is, my spirit shall not abide in man forever. You better think about what he's saying. What he's saying is, there's a point where I'm going to withdraw my spirit from man. There's a point where I'm not like, I have been restraining evil. I have been calling humanity back. God is declaring, I'm not going to keep striving and doing this indefinitely. He is moving to a point from patience towards justice while still extending mercy. He's not saying I'm doing it today. He's saying there's going to be a point where I'm going to not just keep putting up with this. Now, you and I, if we just looked at this like outside of what we know it is in Genesis chapter 6, we'd be like, well, I can't believe God would say something like that. Well, if you look at Genesis chapter 6, 5 through 8, you realize the flood is coming. He's going to deal with the sinfulness of man. And that's where he is. He's like, my spirit shall not abide in man. Like, I'm just telling you. And so what we see is this, God is patient move towards judgment. I'm not going to let this happen forever. That's kind of the first thing. And then his second statement he says is, for he is flesh. So he is using the fact that he is flesh to pretty much announce why he feels the way he feels, which ends up being, I just wish I'd have never made man. He isn't talking about we're made flesh like flesh and blood. He's talking about the reason judgment is we are dominated by sinful inclination. Moral weakness was left unchecked. Rebellion has become the norm with all of these people. I mean, when you read about like getting closer and closer to the ark, man was just really evil. And we get into Sodom and Gomorrah, it's the same thing in verse 7. It's just what God was saying is, man is getting extremely evil. I'm not always going to be this patient. And then God makes a statement. And he says, his days shall be 120 years. Now, so many people will say, well, God is just saying man's going to be 120 years old. His days shall be 120 years. The only problem is the flood happened, and then after the flood, men lived much longer than 120 years. And so God's statement about 120 years, if you look at the three pieces together, what it looks like he's saying is, I'm not always going to deal with this in this way. Man is extremely, extremely sinful, and he's putting a time frame out there of when he's going to deal with it. If it's 120 years, if that's what he's saying, it's 120 years. And people believe that it makes the most sense. He's giving a countdown to the flood, that he's giving a time before judgment, allowing a window of repentance. I was setting up steak with Angelo and Kim last night. Kim is our eye marker. So when you see the steaks, they're lined in a row because Angelo and I are not good at lining them up in a row. And I was just thinking about this in my mind. I was thinking, sometimes we think of 120 years. That doesn't feel like a very long window of time. It just seems like, wow, 120 years, that's kind of a short window of time. This is like God coming in like 1910. And that's probably wrong, but 1910, somewhere in there. And giving, okay, that's when he said, look, I'm getting real impatient with man. If you think about that, we think about our time sometimes, it gets a whole lot broader. And what we really see is that there's some things about God that we begin to learn, and we even begin to learn when he talks about the flood. Genesis 6:3 shows us several things. It shows us God's Spirit strives, God's Spirit warns, God's Spirit restrains, and God's Spirit is not going to be ignored forever. And so God really is teaching us a lot about himself, even in judgment. I'm getting real, my patience with man is growing thin. It's growing 120 years thin. Man is extremely sinful. And then he gets into the wickedness is great. Verse 5 is the thoughts of his heart were only on evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved his heart. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures, and everything that moves along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. And so we're just seeing that right in the middle of all of this is God announcing how he's going to deal with the angels and their actions. So any questions so far before we get down to the last thing, which is the result of corruption? Like, so what after God dealt with this? Because there are always consequences. Questions or thoughts? All right. So pretty much the last thing, because we got to get back to Jude 1:6 in the end, is there are three things that are basically the result of what the angels did. The first one are the Nephilim. And I don't know if I'm saying it right, and I really don't care because it seems like they're horrible people. Somebody read verse 4 again and see what it says about them.
There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. There were the mighty men who were of old men of renown.
All right, if we're not careful, we can read this as the Bible celebrating this production of what happened when these angelic beings got together with. But what we're being told is that what was produced out of this union is really bad. These are products of a deeply corrupted culture. These people were dominant figures because they were warriors, violent men. They during this time shaped society's value. Their reputation endured past their lifetime. They are considered men who were from old, men of renown. In other words, there were children that probably wanted to grow up and be like these men that were giants during that day. They were bad and they were evil, and they represented what people admired during the season time before the flood. They were celebrated for power, not for obedience. And so even though it looks like they're being celebrated, what God is showing us is that the world is celebrating these men. But this is the result of what happens when man begins to cross boundaries and angels begin to cross boundaries of what God has put into place. I think we can see the very same thing in today's society. What we're going to continue to see is people who are so disobedient to God and acting this way, and then they're going to produce children. Whether those children are going to be like is we're getting further and further away from just the normal growing up where most people that we knew growing up, if you said, where do you go to church and where do you worship, the assumption was you were talking about God. That is gone in New York. And it's not in theory. We know it in real life. We have a relationship with a church that works literally is in a public school. And they no longer can have conversation with the children as if they've had exposure to the Bible. They have to start with, they probably don't know which God you're talking about when you start talking about God. And so there's no moral right and wrong. All the right and wrong is being whatever the culture says is right now is what's right. There's not like, you raise your hand if you heard of the Ten Commandments. You know, as kids, most people would have raised their hand. When Tim Tebow had John 3:16, when we were kids, everybody would have known what that was. Now it's like, who's John and why has he got 3:16 on his face? I'll never forget, it was in Budapest, is the missionary in Budapest said the problem with American Christians is we go to countries where people literally have so many gods and we say Jesus is the answer, and their response is, what's the question? And that's the world we live in. And so we just have to understand that's what the church is dealing with, and that's what we're dealing with. And God's patience isn't that He is overlooking what's happening. His patience is that He's trying, and hopefully we are, in the end of Jude, rescue as many as you can. His patience is that many might come to salvation. So anyway, the result is the Nephilim. The second result is the flood. And I think the fact that the flood is a result gives us an amazing verse. If somebody will read, because I read Genesis 6, 5 through 7. Somebody read Genesis 6, 8. How did that verse get in the middle of all this? And there you see the heart of God. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That's what Jude is wanting his believers to understand. Yes, God's dealing with judgment. Yes, he's going to be faithful in judgment. Yes, and one of the things Jude is doing is presenting just some of the ugliness in Scripture that helps us understand there's just always been an ugliness in the world. And not even just the physical world, but this too. But God has always been just, and he's going to be just. So the result of corruption, the Nephilim, the flood, and finally the restraint. Back to Jude 1:6. Somebody read Jude 1:6 one final time. And then this is kind of where we land the plane for tonight.
The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled.
Jude 1:6. That is a good verse, though. That was Genesis, sorry. That's my bad.
And angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved an everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day.
All right, I want to read this one final statement. Jude's point is not to satisfy our curiosity about angels, ancient figures, or mysterious events. His point is to steady the church. And I'm going to stop right there. How are we steadied because of this? Or how do you think he is using this to steady the church? Because it may not feel very steadying. It may more feel like, don't mess with God. But how does this steady you to read about God dealing with these angels in this way? I'm just asking. I don't have an answer that I'm going to give you back. He's got it under control. He's in charge. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
The thing that keeps standing out to me is it says the restraint of God. He could have destroyed them. He could have done something else, but he chose to remove them,
Yeah.
restrain them. So I feel like he showed great restraint, right? Like, I think God is patient with us, and he could do a lot of things with us, but he practices restraint because the heart of God is for us.
Yeah, and where I really got hit with what you're talking about is last week, and God's like, I'm fixing to kill everybody, and Moses is like, whoa. First of all, if that happens, and it's not like Moses was trying to, if that happens, people are going to say, great, God didn't come through, but that's not what got God. Moses pleaded to God out of God's mercy and love and promise through Abraham, will you consider not destroying everybody right now? And so God's answer, again, faithful, fair, is, okay, they're not going into the promised land, their children go in, but the 10 spies, they're gone. Now, and again, that's God's judicial. Anybody else on the striving part, or on the steady in the church? And again, it's reminded that in the same way he deals with that, he has the same kind of hold. And especially when we get towards the end of Jude, where we're like, we are being carried by the love of God. We are so loved by God. So he's steadying the church. He's reminding us that even angels were judged when they abandoned their God-giving boundaries. Jude removes every illusion of exemption, because that is where people love to go. It's everything else, but just not me. Status, influence, knowledge, or past faithfulness do not place anybody above accountability. The same God who judged the rebellion of Genesis 6 is still holy, is still just, is still faithful to preserve those who remain under his authority. Jude 6 does not call us into fear. It calls us into faithfulness. It reminds us that no one outgrows the authority of God, and that rebellion is never redefined as freedom. Even though people like to tell you that it is, it's always defined by judgment. And so it's just a reminder, and I said this kind of Sunday, is we can go out into the world, and not like we're trying, we can bring the king says this into any conversation and stand on it and know not only is it true, but it is the only right answer in the conversation. And we just have to be confident of that. And the world is constantly going to be trying to undercut our confidence. I'm sure that when the church started dealing with all of these people that the enemy was infiltrating them with, that these people were really good at undercutting the confidence. Jude is just trying to get their confidence ready. That's why he started by saying, I'm a servant of the Lord. The Lord has chosen you. He has a keeping you for Jesus. He's loving you in this way. You're beloved like this. He's going to keep giving you mercy and peace, and he's taking care of you. Now, here's how he acts with judgment, and that's where we are right now. It's not the fun part of Jude, but we got one more thing in verse 7. Then we get to verse 8, see how God specifically talks about the people that he's dealing with. And then in verse 9, we get to play a little fun game because it talks about Michael fighting against the demons over the body of Moses, which is not a story that's in Scripture. So that'll be another fun conversation because obviously all of this in Jude is supposed to be and is very relevant for preparing the church to deal with end-time situations, which we know, according to God, one of the biggest is people that are false teachers that will say what the world wants to hear, that will abuse grace and will renounce Jesus as his lordship and his holiness and being Son of God, all of those things we see happening in our world today. Questions, thoughts, comments? I know it's not super fun. That's why I started with the Mark Lowry. So you got to laugh out of it, but in the end, I think we walk away with just remembering that God is love, but God is righteous. Tana?
I think just to piggyback on the authority thing, so many people look at authority as kind of like a bad thing, like discipline and structure and all those things, but those things are good if you don't have them in your church, in your home, and that, like, there's chaos.
Yeah.
You see that in the world, and to be under God's authority, under his love, he has the authority, and you respect that out of love and both directions.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's really weird about this, and I trust God's leadership on this, but we're in Jude on Wednesday night. And I know not everybody is because we got people doing all kinds of stuff, but we're in Jude on Wednesday night. But in 1 Peter this coming Sunday, we're really dealing with God saying, hey, I'm sending you out in the world. This is exactly what you need to do when you go into the world. And then Jude's kind of talking about preparing us to be into the world. I think the big message to the church is we got to get out into the world. We got to get back in the marketplace of where ideas and lies are being told by people and not just sit behind the walls of the church so much, preparing for what's coming. It's already here. And so we got to keep coming back to God and say, what are we supposed to be doing? You've got to show us clearly. We don't want to just invent something that isn't his. And if we're not careful, we just do that. If we're like supposed to be out in the world, so we just go do stuff and we haven't come together and just talk to him and say, how do we get out there more and live in the truth? And in 1 Peter, really is just everyday lived obedience. People seeing it at work and in the world does make a big difference. It's the consistency of you being consistent pays off in people's lives. That's a big part of it.